Hello history lovers and welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a video. And let's continue our deep dive into the life of Queen Anne Boleyn. We are finally coming to the end of our coverage of Anne Boleyn, although there is another video after this. But either way, let's look at her downfall. Now you could argue that Anne's downfall started at various points. The minute she married Henry, when she gave birth to a girl and not a boy. You could pick any point in her life, but I am going to start at the catalyst point, and that's when Catherine of Aragon died on the 7th of January 1536. Prior to this, Anne had been realistically untouchable, but Catherine was her protector, without Anne even really knowing it. With Catherine gone, Henry was now free to get rid of Anne. The 29th of January 1536 marks Catherine's funeral. Henry donned a black attire, while Anne wore yellow again. Meanwhile, Anne was grumbling as the topic of the day revolved around the dead Catherine and not her and her pregnancy.
The cheek, the nerve, the gall, the audacity and the gumption.
Later that afternoon, a pregnant Anne stumbled upon Jane Seymour seated on the king's lap, which sent her into a frenzy. Henry, alarmed by Anne's distress and anxious for the child's well-being, dismissed Jane from the room, attempting to console Anne with soothing words. "Peace be, sweetheart, and all shall go well with thee," he assured her. However, it was too late, as that evening Anne suffered a miscarriage of a male fetus. Chapuis recorded this event, stating, "She has miscarried of her saviour." The king, disappointed and sorrowful, remarked, "I see that God will not give me male children." And so rumours started to spread like wildfire around the court that the king was looking to take a new wife. According to some accounts, Anne's miscarried child was believed to have physical deformities, a notion that was viewed as evidence of maleficence in the minds of the 16th century. Philippa Gregory, in the BBC documentary The Last Days of Anne Boleyn, explained the significance. Anne miscarries a baby, and it is inspected by a midwife, who says it's a boy, but it's malformed. Now that's of enormous importance. The belief was in the medieval world was that if a woman gave birth to a deformed or malformed fetus, then what everybody would genuinely, thoroughly and sincerely believe is that she's done a truly awful sin, and that would be like adultery, like gross adultery, or it would be incest, or it might be witchcraft. But when she loses the baby to Henry, what he sees is conclusive evidence that his wife is not a good woman, and that this marriage is not blessed by God. And that's the least of his fears. I'm certain that he believes that. He may go further and believe that his wife is a witch. However, there is no concrete evidence to suggest anything beyond a tragic end to a normal pregnancy. In a cold and unforgiving mood, Henry entered the Queen's bedchamber, lamenting the loss of his son. Anne, already in tears, confronted him, placing the blame squarely on him. "Oh, I wouldn't do that, Anne, not a good move." In response, Henry declared that she should have no more boys by him. Anne forgot all caution and blamed Henry, yet again, but this time dragged Jane Seymour's name into the mix and explained her outburst. "Because the love I bear you is much greater than Catherine's, my heart broke when I saw you loved others." This prompted an icy response from Henry. "I will speak with you when you are well." He then left Anne and his marriage, both physically and mentally. When he had left, Anne bravely asserted to her ladies that it was all for the best. "I shall be the sooner with child again, and the son I bear will not be doubtful like this one, which was conceived during the life of the Princess Dowager." At the end of January, the Lady Mary became ill again. Her illness was thought to have been a reaction to the death of her mother. Anne tried to rebuild her relationship with her stepdaughter by inviting her back to court. She stated that Mary did not need to carry the Queen's train and that she could walk by her side, but only if she submitted to her father's laws. Mary said no.
No!
What did she say?
Just talking shit!
It was now not a question of if, but a question of when Henry would take another wife. Anne could see this clearly, and she could see that it was Jane Seymour who had betrayed her trust. It was only now that Anne may have truly appreciated how her predecessor Catherine may have felt. Jane was a pain in Anne's behind, as the messages and gifts from the king that once went to Anne now flooded Jane instead. This disrespect hurt Anne, and only made her more jealous and shrewish. She kept an annoyingly close eye on Jane. On the 2nd of April 1536, the king and queen gathered with the court in the Chapel Royal for the Passion Sunday sermon, which was delivered by John Skipp, Anne's personal chaplain. Skipp's topic for the day was religious reform and the dissolution of the monasteries, probably one of the most controversial issues of that time. Now, historians heavily debate whether Skipp was speaking freely or in turn for Anne, as Skipp pretty much criticised everyone who was present, particularly Thomas Cromwell, who by now was a known rival or enemy to Anne. Dr. Susanna Lipscomb suggests that just because Anne's chaplain says something doesn't mean that he's Anne's mouthpiece. However, David Starkey argues that if this sermon isn't evidence, then I don't know what is. What I will say is that as Anne's almoner or chaplain, he would have had Anne's blessing to perform this sermon. So that does not mean it was her idea, although it was highly likely. It also doesn't help that it was well known that Anne had argued with Cromwell over how the proceeds of the dissolution should be spent. She thought they should go towards education and charities rather than her and Henry's pockets. But I will leave you to make your own decisions. It was also in that April that Cromwell informed Henry of his suspicions of Anne. Cromwell was intent of accusing Anne of such a crime that she would be divorced. It was a big risk coming to Henry to present this evidence, as Anne, like her or loathe her, was still Henry's wife and queen. But Henry, who was spurred on by the thought of Jane being her replacement and for a Spanish alliance, which, to be fair, apart from the lack of children, was basically what he had when Catherine was queen, Henry was probably also quite spiteful about the fact that Anne had promised him a prince, and yet so far she'd only delivered one princess. As such, he took Cromwell's allegations against his wife at face value, on the condition that he provide more supporting evidence. I've said it before and I'll say it again. Let's be honest, Henry believed these allegations against Anne because they were convenient. It just aligned with what he wanted. A few weeks later, on the 18th of April 1536, Anne's favour swung. Henry and Anne were at the chapel at Greenwich Palace. The imperial ambassador Eustace Chapuis, who notably disliked Anne, had arrived to arrange peace terms with the king. He had been friends with Catherine of Aragon, and as such had never recognised Anne as queen. He had even refused to meet her in person. Henry and Anne were sat in the royal pew, which was above the chaplain, and they came down the narrow staircase where Chapuis was. Anne and Chapuis had come face to face, and as Anne passed him, he was forced to bow. In bowing to Anne, Chapuis was acknowledging their marriage on the behalf of the Holy Roman Emperor. The thing that strikes me about this is that this interaction would most likely, without a doubt, have been staged by Henry for Chapuis to have to bow to Anne. To which I have many questions. Does that mean he had forgiven her most recent miscarriage? Was Anne back in favour? Was he championing her as his queen again? Was her future arrest premeditated or on a whim? It just seems odd to create this event and then arrest her 2 weeks later, if that is what he was planning at this stage. After he bowed, Anne graciously sank into a deep reverence, as his approval showed hope that Emperor Charles V, the nephew of her rival Catherine, was potentially willing to acknowledge her as queen. But Chapuis was disgusted and ashamed of having bowed to her, to the extent that he did not attend the dinner that evening. Cromwell, on the other hand, had retired to his house at Stepney because he was ill. He would be ill for 2 weeks. This was his chance to collect as much evidence against the Queen as possible. Now, again, this is where I can't read Henry's mind, and I really wish I could, because on the 23rd of April, 1536, when Cromwell returned to court, Henry was acting like he had no idea of what was going on in the background, and even wrote to the ambassador of Rome saying, "God will send us heirs male by our most dear and most entirely beloved wife, the Queen." Okay, Henry, what you playing at? 3 days later, Anne sensed that something was wrong and made, in hindsight, the right decision of charging her chaplain Matthew Parker with the care of her precious daughter Elizabeth. One of Cromwell's spies informed him that the Queen had let courtiers into her chamber at undue hours. These men, you may already be able to guess, were George Boleyn, Lord Rochford, Sir Henry Norris, Sir Francis Weston, William Brereton, and Mark Smeaton. Anne was well known for flirting and encouraging admiration, but you have to remember that Anne practically grew up in the French court, and that was their way of doing things. She had been taught the ways of courtly love, where a knight could court a woman far above his status, wear her colours as tournament, compose songs and poems, and to an extent, pursue her. Although that did normally end in sex. But Anne had self-control. She kept Henry at bay, until she didn't, and got pregnant. But, that was still like 7 years she said no. Cromwell, on the other hand, had all that he needed. He charged Anne with adultery with the 5 men and conspiracy to murder the king. She was also charged with incest with her brother. This last charge was added on due to what George's wife, Jane Boleyn, had said in court. It is believed by some that this was a malicious attack from Jane, who was allegedly jealous of Anne and George's close bond. But I'm not convinced. I'm also not convinced that Anne was A, desperate enough to have sex with her brother in order to conceive. She has proven that she is fertile and can get pregnant easily. And B, she knew she had enemies everywhere, and how her position in the king's favour kept swinging. I don't think she would try and jeopardise this with an affair. Also, she would be risking her position by plotting to kill the king, as her enemies would be out for the kill without his protection. Cromwell is a prime example, and that's with Henry being around. Imagine if he wasn't. On the 29th of April, Cromwell finally presented his evidence to Henry, who flew into a rage. Again, is this genuine rage? I'm not too sure.
I want to believe you.
When he had calmed himself, he gave the order for the arrest of Anne and those 5 men. The next day, Anne's musician Mark Smeaton was interrogated for 24 hours, and notably, he is the only man of the 5 to admit his guilt. But he was tortured into a confession, and he was also the only man who wasn't a noble, as torture as a way to get a confession was not to be used on the nobility. So the fact that he is the only one to plead guilty doesn't surprise me.
Coincidence? I think not!
A charge of adultery wasn't enough for Anne to be executed. Normally, a woman who was convicted of adultery, because remember it was fine for the men to have affairs, mistresses, a woman would be sent to a convent. But Cromwell was gunning for a death sentence, so he had to try and create the worst charge possible, an act of high treason, plotting the king's death. Henry was paranoid, so actually convincing Henry that men in his court were plotting to kill him would not have been too hard for Cromwell to pull off. At 9 a.m. on Tuesday the 2nd of May 1536, Anne Boleyn was watching a favourite pastime of hers, and also the King's, real tennis at Greenwich. Anne was partial to gambling and expressed regret at not placing a bet on the winner. As she does so, a messenger arrives and gives the Queen a message from the King, who was currently at Whitehall. She is told that she is to present herself to the Privy Council, who were also in Greenwich. Anne's time was limited. Chapuis reported that the King was looking for a younger wife, who we know will be Jane Seymour. It's the joy and pleasure a man feels in getting rid of a thin, old, vicious horse, in the hope of getting soon a fine horse to ride.
Gonna need a sensu for that one.
At 9:30, Anne is escorted from the tennis courts at Greenwich to the Privy Council meeting, unaware of what she's done wrong. 15 minutes later, she was greeted by the Constable of the Tower, William Kingston, Sir William Fitzwilliam, Sir William Paulet, and her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, all of whom were grim-faced. Anne would later recall how, "I was cruelly handled at Greenwich, with the King's Council, with my Lord of Norfolk," and then he said, "Tut, tut, tut," shaking his head 3 or 4 times. Now, I don't like the Duke of Norfolk, but the way he tuts at Anne like a naughty child, with the foresight of what happens next, actually makes my skin crawl. Unfortunately, this was his slimy way of distancing himself from his niece. He would play the same game with his other niece, Catherine Howard. They charged her with having committed adultery with Norris, Smeaton, and one other man who was not at that time named. At 11 o'clock, Anne was back in her apartments at Greenwich under armed guard. Although she had been charged, she had not been arrested. So she continues her normal routine and has dinner, although I guess it's more like lunch. Don't forget, Anne is still queen, for now, so she sits under a canopy of state, expressing her authority, and she wore a red velvet gown and a cloth of gold. Despite everything, Anne is trying to keep up appearances. However, I can only imagine how unnerving it was for her as she looked around and saw that her ladies were tearing up. Anne was an intelligent woman. I can imagine that by the end of her meal, she knew that this was Cromwell's doing. At 1:45, Cromwell entered the dining room with a large entourage, which included Uncle Norfolk, but now he had a scroll in his hand. This was Anne's arrest warrant. I'm sure it's not a surprise when I say that Anne and Norfolk's relationship was not the best at this moment. Anne rose from her seat and asked the men why they had come, not knowing that her uncle was carrying her arrest warrant. Norfolk responds, "We came by the King's command to conduct Anne to the Tower of London." Now, like or loathe her, one thing you cannot take away from Anne is how she handled the situation. Apart from her moments of hysteria, she remained calm and composed. She replied, "If it be His Majesty's pleasure, then I am ready to obey." Anne is to leave Greenwich. She wasn't allowed to pack, as she was told everything she would need would be at the Tower. She couldn't summon her ladies, or even say goodbye to her daughter, Elizabeth. Cromwell was desperate to get this done as quickly as possible. Anne and Henry had always had a turbulent relationship, fiery arguments, and passionate make-ups. Anne had to be gone before Henry had time to change his mind. So where was Henry? He was 10 miles away at Whitehall, and it was reported that he was in great spirits. His court at Whitehall was lively. There were feasts and banquets, and eyewitness reports say that he has daily gone out to dine here and there with ladies, and sometimes has remained with them until after midnight. At 3 p.m. that afternoon, Anne is escorted from her apartments at Greenwich down to the Thames, and leading the way was none other than Thomas Cromwell. Probably the last person she wanted to see. There was a barge waiting for her at the beach to take her to the Tower. Fun fact, the original Tudor pier still survives today, and Anne Boleyn would have boarded the boat from that pier. So next time you're in London, pop over to Greenwich and see if you can see it. It was customary for prisoners to have been taken to the Tower at night time. However, Anne is taken during broad daylight for everyone to see, just another way for Henry and Cromwell to inflict humiliation on her. Cromwell also boards the boat with Anne on what must have been the most awkward 2-hour boat ride ever. Anne arrives at the Tower of London at 5:15. Prisoners would normally be escorted through Traitors' Gate, but as Anne was still Queen of England, albeit not for very long, she was brought through Court Gate as recognition of her rank and status. When Anne enters the Tower, cannon fires sound, so the King in Whitehall can hear that she has been taken in. This next bit is one of the few times Anne's composure breaks. The sound of the cannons must have triggered something, as when she arrived, she had to be assisted from the barge and up the steps. She then fell to her knees, praying to God for his help, as she was not guilty of her accusement. She then begged the council members around her to beseech the King's grace to be good unto her. Anne acknowledges that the last time she was here, she was received with greater ceremony, as it was her coronation. She then asks William Kingston if she will be going to the dungeons, to which he responds, "No, madam. You shall go into the lodgings you lay in at your coronation." Don't know if Kingston had a Cockney accent, but that's how I'm imagining him in my brain. "All right, governor." Anne declared, "My God, bear witness, there is not truth in these charges. I am as clear from the company of man as from sin." Kingston helped her off the floor and into the Tower. Little did she know that Kingston had been tasked by Cromwell to record and feed back everything that Anne said. Anne being placed in her apartments rather than the dungeons probably gave her a false sense of security, as it couldn't be that bad, right? I imagine she gave a minuscule sigh of relief, and she was a bit shocked but also happy at the news. At 5:30 that afternoon, the name of the third man that she allegedly slept with is revealed to be her brother, George Boleyn.
What?
Anne was appointed 4 ladies by Cromwell, 4 ladies who Anne didn't like nor trust. But Cromwell needed more evidence, and 1 spy wasn't enough. Later that evening, Cromwell was preparing for the upcoming trials. Despite Anne being unpopular, she still had some powerful allies, which explains the imprisonment of Sir Henry Norris and George Boleyn. But Cromwell had one shot to take Anne down, and he wasn't going to take any chances. All bases had to be covered. At 10 p.m. that evening, Anne's mood is darkening. William Kingston, the constable of the Tower, pays the Queen a visit. Anne protests her innocence to Kingston. "I am the King's true wedded wife." She then asks Kingston if he knew why she was there. He simply replies with no. Anne most likely started to panic, and understandably wants to know where her supporters are, particularly her father. But like her uncle Norfolk, Thomas Boleyn distanced himself from his daughter to save his own skin. Now, from a modern viewpoint, I find it totally disgusting that Thomas basically abandoned 2 of his children to save his own life and career. I'm not a parent, but surely some sort of parental instinct would kick in? And you want to protect your children at all costs. Both Anne and George must have been terrified. Maybe not at this point, but definitely once they knew they were going to get the chop. I'm sorry, Thomas Boleyn, but you are on my gits list. I also want to point out that there is no record of any member of the Boleyn family trying to contact Anne and George while they were in the Tower, nor did they try and help or intercede on their behalf. When thinking about what she could have done to upset Henry, it is possible that Anne reflected back to the 30th of April, when she teased Henry Norris about why he had not gone through with his proposal to her cousin Madge Shelton. She said, "You look for dead men's shoes, for if aught came to the king, but good you would look to have me." Now this is potentially damning evidence, as Anne was talking about the death of the king. Even Henry's doctors would not tell him he was dying at the end of his life, so understandably, Norris was shocked and denied this. If he should have any such though, he would his head were off. But now she was probably worried that her remarks might have been overheard or misconstrued. If they had, one might think that she was plotting to kill him. The Queen's ladies were deeply concerned about what was said between Anne and Norris, so much so that Anne demanded that Norris go see her chaplain John Skipp and swear for the Queen that she was a good woman. Anne must have said this out loud, as her ladies in the Tower were reporting to Kingston everything she said, and Kingston was reporting this back to Cromwell, as is evident in a letter to Cromwell from Kingston, where he said that Anne had told Mrs. Coffin, one of her ladies, how she had teased Sir Francis Weston, because he did love her kinswoman, Mrs. Shelton, and that she said he loved not his wife. He then replied, he loved one in her house better than. Anne asked him who. He responded with, it is yourself. Now, listen to me. In his defence, this was technically the right answer. It was a game of courtly love. He was flattering his queen and mistress. She was the Queen of England. Shouldn't everyone be in love with the Queen of England? And just in case there was any confusion, Madge was engaged or courting Henry Norris, but Francis Weston was flirting with her. Unfortunately, this was all the evidence that Cromwell needed, and it would be very damaging for Anne and her case. In conclusion, Anne Boleyn's fall from grace is a gripping tale of ambition, politics, and intrigue in the Tudor court. It's a story that has fascinated people for centuries. We've explored the key events and characters that led to her dramatic downfall. Her legacy endures as a testament to the ever-shifting sands of power and the enduring mysteries of history. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of history's most captivating chapters. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe for more historical content, and don't forget to leave your thoughts and comments below, and as always, have a wonderful day.